Welcome to the Fam Lab. We are so glad that you have joined us today. We have a really exciting conversation that Rosalind and Tiffany were able to have with Dr. Jennifer Schroeder from Abilene Christian University and Miss Sarah Cash from North Atlanta Church of Christ as they discuss some of the topics around how we be more inclusive as a church, how we talk about spiritual formation in a more inclusive way, and really excited for you to get to hear that conversation. Dr. Jennifer Schroeder teaches at Abilene Christian University, where she is professor of ministry, and she also directs their summit lectures. Before coming to ACU, she had 17 years of experience in children's ministry, and it's just a wealth of knowledge about ministry in general and how we talk about faith with our kids. And we're also blessed to have Sarah Cash on this conversation as well. She's a practicing attorney and a mother of four who is very intentional about raising her kids in a way that sees everybody as being made in the image of God, and we're very blessed to have Sarah on this conversation. So we're going to start our conversation here. Rosalind and Tiffany joined by Jennifer and Sarah. Hope you enjoy.
Welcome to the Fam Lab. Today we're delving into a conversation that centers around nurturing a connection between children and their faith. I am thrilled to have both of our incredible guests here today. We look forward to both of you sharing your wisdom, insights on a topic close to the hearts of many, and that's encouraging our kids to see themselves in the image of God. So let's begin with some introductions. Tell us who you are and what you do, and let's start with you, Jennifer.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Schroeder. I'm going to apologize for my voice. The allergies are bad here in Abilene right now, but I am the college fellow for Children and Family Ministry here at Abilene Christian University, and then I also serve as summit director.
And tell us a little bit about your family as well.
Oh, I am a mom to four kids. I have an 11-year-old son and then triplets who are 9. And so we are well into those elementary and middle school age years. And if we are not laughing, there's a good chance we're crying. So it's a lot of fun, but we just embrace the chaos each and every day.
Sounds good. Okay, what about you, Sarah?
So I will see your laughing and crying and raise you a yelling and screaming because we have a lot of I'm Sarah Cash. I am here in Atlanta, beautiful Atlanta, Georgia, a native of Atlanta. I am an attorney by trade, a dirt lawyer, practiced real estate law for several years, and now I'm in management at a certain company here in Atlanta. But I am the mother of 4 also. My ages are 12 and a half, 11, 8, and 6, 2 girls, 2 boys.
Oh, wow. That's great. Well, okay, we're just going to jump right in. I want to start by saying that we share a universal desire to help our children recognize their place in the divine narrative. However, within Christian communities, it's not always apparent that there are barriers that may unknowingly obstruct a child's spiritual development. And today we want to explore some of those issues and begin a conversation around equipping parents and our church communities with actionable ideas to guide our children toward a deeper connection with their faith. So, Jennifer, I want to start with you and ask how your doctoral research led you to explore the intersection of race, identity, and spiritual formation in children.
So when I started the work, I was actually at North Atlanta with Sarah. And so I know and love her kids wonderfully. I mean, they're amazing, amazing family, amazing kids. But I was there working, and North Atlanta is a diverse congregation made up of many different races and ethnicities across the board. However, what we had started figuring out as a church is that while we were a diverse church, we were not necessarily a multicultural and inclusive one. We were still operating out of a very dominant culture framework, a very ethnocentric framework. And so I had, prior to the pandemic, I had already started imagining what does that need to look like in our children's ministry, because I was the children's minister there. What does that need to look like in our children's ministry? And as a result, started thinking through and working through what are the resources we're using? What are the conversations we're having? How are we specifically attending to the identity of each and every child that walks through that door? And I hope Sarah doesn't mind. I'm going to tell a story on her. And so in June of 2020, I was working on a large project as part of my doctoral work. And in that project, I don't know how Sarah and I even got on the phone that night about something, but we were talking on the phone and we started talking about this idea, this important conversation that we have to have surrounding race and identity and churches, and how our church was still really operating out of a very dominant cultural lens, and what that did to our students, to our kids, and how they were unable to see themselves as Imago Dei as a result of that. And at one point, and we had been on the phone call for a while, and then because both of us have 4 kids, it was time to put all 8 kids, to bed. And so we ended the phone call, but we kept texting for a little bit thereafter. And I say this and have said this to many, and I think I've said this to Sarah. I feel honored and blessed that she felt comfortable enough to just say, "Hey, Jennifer, we've got to do something about this. If we are truly going to make sure all of our kids come to know and have a close relationship with God, we've got to do something about this." And so in my doctoral dissertation, the opening quote comes directly from that text exchange that Sarah and I had.
Mm.
And so that is kind of the impetus that led to this conversation. And from there, I carried out focus groups with lots of members of our church. And because of the pandemic, we were all becoming much more familiar with Zoom and with doing these sorts of online interactions. And so I was able to really dive heavily into research and begin exploring, both from a sociological perspective, but also from a theological and practical ministry perspective, of how all of this collided, and the negative ramifications if we were to continue down this path long term.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you to kind of keep going with that. As someone in children's ministry, when I heard about your research and what you were doing, I was excited because you're right. We want diverse congregations, but more importantly, we want multicultural congregations, and we want to speak to the needs and of all of our children. So what were some of your key findings that highlight the importance of identity and spiritual formation for children?
Well, some of it comes out of an understanding of the importance of belonging and mattering.
Mm.
And
Okay.
belonging and mattering are crucial for kids as they develop their identity, as they grow into adults, as they find their place within the world. And what we've seen, and I apologize if I jump around, my brain kind of works in that way. But what we have seen is kids as early as 2 and 3 start understanding their place within small groups and large groups. They start being socialized to determine where are they an in group, where are they an out group, and then they start internalizing that messaging. And as a result, that leads to either a disconnect between belonging and mattering, or a connection between belonging and mattering. So when you think about it from the in terms of children's ministry, what are we saying? What are we demonstrating? What are the visual communicators that are giving a direct representation of this population of people is considered the in group, and this population of people is considered the out group? And then how does that impact both their development within the faith community, but their development as a child of God?
So important. Sarah, I'm going to ask you to jump in and ask how you address your children's questions and doubts about their identity in God's image.
Hmm. How I address their doubts. That's heavy. Because I'm still addressing my own, right?
Mm,
Um,
right.
I grew up and initially it was a kind of a mixed community church. Um, and then it kind of transitioned to a predominantly Black church, but there wasn't a lot of imagery um, in church. It was more imagery that I saw just in society, right? Jesus was brown hair and blue eyes, and all the movies had Jesus depicted that.
Hmm.
Um, and so for a long time, Jennifer and I talked about this, when the idea shifted and more research was being done and people were looking at the location of the biblical stories and realized, I don't think it's possible for Jesus to have had blue eyes and fair skin. um Even some of the more recently generated images that depict how Jesus most likely looked, it's like, for me, it's hard to accept because I grew up thinking a certain way. And I find
Mm,
that my children, a couple of them have asked questions about, there's just the assumption that Jesus is a white guy. And um, for me, it's more, number one, that's not like realistically correct, but also look around at the world and all of the different colors and shades and the beauty of color that God clearly loves, right? And people and animals and trees and flowers, like God clearly loves various colors. So why does it even matter that much, right? And what does the focus on the color of Jesus's skin or the texture of Jesus's hair, what does that detract you from in the message that Jesus is trying to convey? I think I tend to try to reshift it towards the message and the feeling and the instruction of Jesus as opposed to his physical attributes.
mhm. Mhm. I appreciate that, and I also appreciate you saying that you're still trying to figure that
Yeah.
out, and, I feel like I've been in the same boat too, that I've still tried to figure that out, and interestingly enough, I have 3 kiddos, and they're ages 20 to 24, and it has just been the last couple of years that they have started talking to me about some of the doubts and some of the anxiety that they had growing up in a diverse, somewhat diverse congregation, but having everything come through an ethnocentric lens. So it's such an important conversation. So Jennifer, back to you. How can parents and Bible class teachers initiate conversations with children about race, identity, and spirituality that are age appropriate and meaningful?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I wish I had a really easy answer that would be like your infomercial money back guarantee.
Right?
But unfortunately, I don't. I think it's important to just address it, to not shy away from it, to
Mhm,
just say, like for example, I think about one of the resources that is really heavily used within the world of children's ministry, and it was one that I used a ton. Um, of looking at it and saying to a child, hey, let's look at the story of whether it's Jesus or whether it's Philip and the Ethiopian or whether it's Moses and Pharaoh, any number of stories, and let's say, hey, let's look at how these characters are being depicted in this Bible story. What do we know about where this took place? What can we imagine about what these important figures in the Bible probably looked like? And we don't know for sure, but what could we probably know based on what we do know about the world? And just be really active and intentional about engaging in conversations like that. And
mhm,
I think even just as reticent as one might feel, because I know there are times that I'm engaging in this conversation with churches or with my kids or with other adults, and I might feel awkward or I might feel worried that I'm going to say the wrong thing. And instead of letting that determine what I do or do not do, I need to just dive in and be willing to ask for forgiveness if I say the wrong thing, willing to kind of reshape, but but just engage in conversations where we acknowledge with our kids, God made each and every one of us specifically in God's image. And whether that means your skin color is white or black or brown or any other shade under the sun, God made you in God's image. So let's imagine what that can look like. And here we see an image of God depicted in an Asian body. And here we see an image of God depicted in a black body, an African American body, in a Latin American body, and just make that the norm rather than the exception. I think that's one of the big things. Is right now, for many of our visual representations of Jesus and of general characters that come through the stories in the Bible still skew very Eurocentric. Even ones, and I had another person from North Atlanta who she and I had this conversation. She said, even the depictions that perhaps the skin color is darker, the features are still very Eurocentric. And so, where was I going with this? Oh, I know. And so rather than just limit ourselves to those Eurocentric representations, let's engage in a multiplicity of representations of all of the different imago Deis that are represented through the image of God, all of the different identities and people that are represented. And so by doing that, just consistently and across the board, it ceases to become the exception and it starts to become the norm.
It just makes you more
I love
comfortable with the idea of it being different from how you may have it in your head. One of my favorite books that I've ever read is The Shack. Have y'all read The Shack? Have you read The Shack?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I won't spoil it for you, Jennifer, but I highly recommend it. It's the story of a man who went through a traumatic experience and had pretty much like wiped away his relationship with God. And so God sent him a letter and invited him to a shack in the middle of the woods for a weekend. And they spent time together and he learned a lot. But one of the things that I like about the book is when he came to the shack initially, God was a Black woman. And so it was like gender and race, like plot twist, right? And so the man is like trying to wrap his head around this Black woman who's presenting herself as God. And God is like, I can be a Black woman, I can be an Asian man, I can be like whatever. I can represent myself physically in whatever form you need to see me in so that you can feel comfortable having the conversation that we need to have. And that imagery, it's a movie now. That imagery has always stuck with me and kind of shifted my perspective of like the various ways that God can present God himself.
Yeah, I think that's such a shift to just take what you've always seen and throw it out the window and open your mind to all these different representations. And I want to ask you, Sarah, as a mom, we think about what y'all were just describing, these different representations we may see in different environments. But in your home, how can you foster an environment of love and acceptance and self-worth to really help your child develop a strong sense of being made in the image of God?
Yeah. I think it starts a lot with just openness and I don't know how well I'm doing, but I try to teach empathy. Empathy is a really important
Absolutely.
feeling that I want my kids to fully grasp, right? Because if you can put yourself in somebody else's shoes and show concern, then I makes the world a better place. And also, I feel like it puts you in a position where some of those characteristics that are important to society, you realize don't really matter because if you can see yourself in others, then those characteristics don't matter as much as the situations that people are dealing with. So the first thing I do is try to make sure that they understand that we are all people. We all have feelings. We all have good and bad days. We all want to be accepted and loved. And the second thing I think is just having conversations with them when they have situations where they don't feel like they belong, and giving them space to verbalize that, and helping them think through how they can have conversations with whatever person made them feel that way, so that the next time it can be a more welcoming environment. Imagery in my house, I went upstairs to get some books. One of my favorite books is God's Dream by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and just the imagery of all the different kids in the book, and they're all different backgrounds and nationalities, and it's, I think, a very inclusive book that we've always read when I was little. And then I think it's also like self love and self acceptance too, right? Like, God don't make mistakes. It's a phrase that has lived through the years. And so helping them to understand that you are the way you are because that's how God wanted you. Like, God specifically wanted you exactly this way. And God specifically wanted him exactly that way and her exactly that way. So helping them to understand the intentionality that God one is an issue.
I love that.
I love that. I love all of this. I love that you brought up The Shack. That is such a good book and a good movie.
The book is better.
And so,
The book is
Jennifer,
better than the movie.
the book is, yeah, book is better. Yes, Jennifer, please put that on your list. Also, it's so funny because I was talking to one of my coworkers about just the questions, and I feel like, Jennifer, you kind of brought this up, that, kids will ask the questions. They're not so uncomfortable with asking the questions. Really, it's adults that have the discomfort of answering the questions and trying to figure out where to go when kids bring these issues up. And Jennifer, I want to ask you, are there any biblical or religious teachings that can serve as a foundation for teaching children about the diversity of God's creation and the inherent value of every individual? I think it's helpful if, teachers, parents have a place to start biblically.
Can I say the book of Acts? Can I just throw the book of Acts?
Right.
But really, that's one of the foundational places. When we see on the day of Pentecost, all of the nations, all of the tongues coming together, we start to see the beauty of what that fullness of the kingdom of God can look like. And then as you move through the book of Acts, when is it Acts 15, council at Jerusalem, and talking about how that to be a person of God does not mean shedding who you are, does not mean shedding your identity, does not mean kind of making yourself into what one group of people wants you to be, but actually being who you were created to be. And so I think those are really good kind of foundational points and starting places for having this conversation, for illustrating what does it look like to truly live into the kingdom of God. And then, you go to Revelation, where it talks about every nation, every tribe, every tongue being there present in heaven. And we want it to be on earth as it is in heaven. And so I think kind of taking those as jumping off points would be really great ones. And I realize that sometimes the book of Acts as a whole doesn't feel as accessible to kids as it may to adults, or parents don't imagine it to be as accessible to kids because it's not a neat and tidy story. But I think it is, and I think we devalue the possibility of kids understanding what's going on when we shy away from it because it's not one of our more traditional Bible stories. But I think it is a really good starting point for helping us think through what does it look like to really be an inclusive family of God. And I guess I want to add to this, and I meant to say this earlier, one of the things that when I was looking at the research and thinking through what does it mean to be inclusive versus diverse, and I use those terms very differently. And diversity is simply the differences that are there present. It doesn't mean we're doing anything about them. It just means that differences exist. And when we're talking about multicultural and inclusive, we're talking about valuing and accepting and making an active part those differences. And so when we look at that, we have to place a high value on uniqueness and a high value on belongingness. And so it's not just saying, let's bring all the differences together and they're a multicultural and inclusive community we will make, but it's saying, come be a part of this community of faith, and we value you for exactly who you are, and you belong for exactly who you are. And both of those characteristics are hugely important.
Jennifer, those are such healing words and such good words for people to hear. And it's funny, I was having a brief conversation yesterday with Sarah on the phone, and this is a whole nother probably podcast topic, but we talked a little bit about code switching and how as African Americans, I mean, we've learned how to code switch. We're pretty good at code switching. Our ancestors, their survival depended on being able to be something different when they were surrounded by people that look different and that oppress them. And so we've taken that and we have the ability to do that, but as Christians and trying to have this multicultural congregation and community, it does not serve us so much when people don't get to love us for who we are. And so that's just something, that's why that's just so beautiful and healing to me, because we need to be able to bring our authentic selves to worship and to our communities. And it's just very painful when you think that for so many reasons we haven't felt like we've been able to do that. So thank you for saying that and for sharing that. I also want to bring up a little bit because we talked about a lot of the images that are kind of more ethnocentric and come through that lens, but also it's hard to talk about, but there are things that as Bible class teachers and as children's ministry leaders, we might come face to face with in our curriculum, things that are negative. And so, how do we go about addressing those issues and try to figure out if what we're doing with our children in Bible class and at home is actually helping, or in some cases, it and unknowingly maybe hurting them?
From a Bible class perspective, from a children's ministry perspective, one of the things I think we have to be willing to do is really turn a careful and intentional lens onto every single thing we do. I think earlier in our conversation, I mentioned something about best practices. So much of what is published comes out of a long history of best practices in children's ministry. And yet, who is it best practices for? Has to always be the question. And sometimes it's really easy, because I served in the world of children's ministry for 17 years. It's really easy to go, oh my goodness, I've got so much to do. I've got to get these lessons out. I've got to make sure teachers have this, X, Y, and Z. And in the process of doing so, neglect to really intentionally look at the materials I'm handing out, whether that be the written word or printed materials or manipulatives, and really evaluate, is it ethnocentric or is it ethno-relative? Is it demonstrating a very one-dimensional dominant culture perspective of Christianity? Because, quite truthfully, the history of Christianity, the history of Black Christianity specifically, came through white Christianity. And so it still heavily shapes much of what is out there. whether intentionally so or not. And so we, as children's ministers, as Bible class teachers, as volunteers, have to be willing to evaluate and then set aside something that might be easily accessible, but really may not be the best resource to take advantage of, because everything communicates something, whether we intend it to or not. Everything communicates something. And so one of the exercises I have my children's ministry students go through, and behind me, like right there on the shelf, that's like my full bookshelf of children's Bibles. And I have hundreds of children's Bibles. And I pull them all out and I ask them to start going through them and looking at which ones are both theologically sound and culturally, multiculturally diverse in their presentation.
One of the things that I was thinking about, Rosalind, that you said about bringing your authentic self to church specifically is when you don't, it's almost like you're doing a slight disservice to God, because it's like he created this wonderful, like miraculous thing, and you're covering it up and hiding portions of it from your family, your church family.
Mm-hmm.
So that flashed in my mind. But
That's
go ahead.
Oh, and I thought that tied in so nicely to what you had already said, Sarah, that God doesn't make mistakes and that he's intentional. And he intentionally created each of us to be who we are to be. And if we show up in a way that's not that, then we're kind of denying, the reflection of his glory and how he intended you to be and how he very intentionally created you.
Right. And he's also relational, right? And so the me that he needs, like some church member in that day, in that moment, if I don't bring my real me, am I going to be able to communicate with him or support him or love him the way that he needs to be supported and communicated with and loved in that moment? I think that it's not just about who God made us, but it's also who God made us for each other.
Mm-hmm.
Rosalind and I recently, we talked about how this is the second of our podcasts, but we talked to someone, we were talking about the context of special needs and about how when we look at each of us as individuals and how we are created in the image of God, that we all in some ways reflect some of that character of God, and denying any part of ourselves, I think, can also potentially deny helping others to see a little bit more of that character of God.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But Jennifer, you were talking about children's Bibles, and some of my favorite children's Bibles came from you in North Atlanta because of the diverse representation of some of the characters. And so it's more if my kids can see images in their children's Bible that shows a wide variety of people, even though it may not be 100% accurate, that there may be Asian people in the Bible pictures, but if they're looking at a large group of people and the purpose of what's being said in the Bible is inclusivity and everyone matters and we all should share and show love to God, seeing a wide variety of faces and colors and hair types just helps younger children realize I'm in that cluster somewhere. I think that's really, really important.
Mm-hmm. That and you've already kind of jumped into my next question, which is really for both of you. And what are the specific strategies, books, or educational tools you would recommend to parents and educators to promote inclusivity and unity among children of diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds in the context of spiritual growth? And so I brought some books too. I have a couple. This one,
Okay.
Illustrated Bible Poems, is a good one. And this is one that I love. And Jennifer, I think you actually
Yeah.
told me about God's Holy Darkness, which
Yeah.
I love because, one of those barriers sometimes is that we talk about darkness and blackness in such a negative light that it can become intrinsic to
Mhm.
children of color,
Mhm.
and they see themselves as bad or sinful
Mhm.
because of the color of their
Mhm.
skin. And
Yep.
so, this is a great, really good book to shed a positive light
Yeah.
on
I'm
darkness.
so
So,
glad you
I just
pointed
wanted to
that
bring that in.
out because when you showed that book cover, I thought, holy darkness, right? Like it kind of took me by surprise. And for that reason, I'm glad you specified that and pointed that out.
Yeah. Well, I want to hear more from you guys. What you have for us.
Well, and like I'm looking, I wish I had pulled it. Oh, here it is. Um, sorry.
I knew she had it closer all the time.
Yeah, I have a, what people can't see is I have a stack of books on both sides of me that got cleared out of the way for me to record this. But this is a new one,
Yeah.
Peace
Oh,
Table. It's a new children's Bible, like literally just published.
wow.
And so I think one of the things I try to do is, and I have people all over that when they see a Bible, old or new, they send me a picture. Do you have this one? And if I don't, I'm like, get it for me and I'll Venmo you the money. But I'm constantly looking for children's Bibles like that one. The Jesus Storybook Bible is another good one that starts to look at different images. Um, there's a new one that's come out that actually created a fair amount of controversy when it came out. Um, and so I've talked a lot about this one to various people, but it's called Brown Baby Jesus.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And when it came out, it's a beautiful book on just the story of the birth of Jesus. And when it came out, we had a lot of people going, well, that's not accurate. That's not accurate. That's not accurate. And then the pushback, and I mean this very gently, and I don't mean this um, to come across harsh, was my question was, well, when presented with then a white representation of Jesus, why was your reaction also not, well, that's not accurate. That's not historically accurate. That's the word I left out. That's not historically accurate. And so I think going back to an earlier statement, we've got to just look for the different resources that show all sorts of representation of who God is and how God exists in this world so that we don't imagine a really narrow scope because God is way bigger than anything we could possibly imagine. And to not constantly help our kids see that is to not only do a disservice to their development, but to do a huge disservice to God.
Mhm.
I mean, it's really, and I think Sarah made that point a moment ago, it diminishes the totality of who God
Mhm.
is. And that weighs heavily on me.
Mhm.
And so I just encourage parents to pull down all of the Bible storybooks that they have and start looking through and really look through with a critical lens of saying, does this represent the fullness of God's kingdom? And if not, be willing to set it aside or be willing to make it not your primary source because publishing companies are doing a better job of, of producing resources that show a greater breadth of the scope of who all of us each are as made in the image of God.
Yeah.
A children's story. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Sarah.
No, I think I love that. And I also think it's a step further. I also think it's some introspection. Like when you pull those books off your shelf and you're looking at more diverse books and you have some hesitation or, some anxiety with having a book that shows a much wider representation, figuring out why you have that reaction. Why do you feel that way? What are some of the
Yeah.
things you were taught that kind of closed off your perspective? And dealing with that also, right? Because it's not just the books, it's how you talk to your kids. It's that nonverbal thing that they're watching, that they see how you react to people who are different from you. And some introspection and some time and just some self-growth, I think would go a long way also.
I very much agreed. And so when we were talking about what the changes we needed to make at North Atlanta, kind of putting together. It's called an intervention project as part of this doctoral research, and so I mean that's a weird terminology, but that's just the language behind it. One of the things we talked about is it's not just enough to change the physical resources we use, but to also encourage our volunteers and our teachers, and like Sarah's saying with parents, encourage people to do some introspection. You know, why am I reacting the way I am? How do I self reflect and make changes in the way that I communicate the biblical text and the biblical lens? And those changes needed to not just occur on this superficial level, but on a deeper level as well, with not just what we were doing for the kids, but with the adults too.
Oh, that's all fabulous. Guys, do you, as we begin to wrap up, have any last thoughts about our topic or anything we discussed?
I do. One last thought.
Okay.
Um, as we interact with our children, particularly a diverse group of children, I think one of the best early things that a children's ministry leader can do is ask questions about that child. What do they like? What do they do on holidays and weekends?
Mm,
What are some of their family traditions? What are some of the songs and movies and experiences that really shaped them? Because it does two things. Number one, it gives talking points, right? So it's not just asking, what do you think of this well known singer, right? Who a large majority of your white peers may listen to, but you don't because that's not your musical genre that you're interested in. So it gives you talking points with that particular person, but it also gives relational opportunities where you can be like, oh, when you were 4, your parents took you apple picking. Does anybody else have that experience? And it helps a diverse group of people see similarities with each other that they otherwise might not have gotten to, right, in normal conversation. One of the things I love to do, I stole it from my daycare. When I have new team members, I send them like a little, like, what's your favorite food? What's your favorite cake flavor? If you had $20, what would you do with it? Where's your favorite vacation spot? Just like little things, getting to know them. And it helps me to feel connected to them because I'm like, oh, I do this and that and that. Oh, and we both like chocolate covered raisins. I don't. But, finding a connection point is hard sometimes in normal conversation. And so if you start off your school year, your Bible class year, whatever, having just a Q&A, early questions and answers, it'll help the teacher understand where that child is coming from, and also might help those children from different backgrounds see connection points between them. And that, I think, will enhance the inclusivity goal.
mhm.
I don't think I could have said that any better myself, so I hate to say anything after her because I love that. And I think what that does, though, and it goes back to the point that we've already talked about, is it it communicates that who each and every individual is within that room is vitally
Mhm.
important and vitally needed and valued for exactly who they
Mhm.
are. And I think that is one of the tremendously significant elements in fostering this greater sense of belonging and mattering as children of God.
Mhm. Yesterday, Tiffany and I were talking about the fact of diverse groups coming together and talking and getting to know each other. And oftentimes will leave the table focused on what they have in common
Mm,
more than how they're different.
exactly.
And I guess as we leave this conversation, I would just say, when you find out that there is something different, dig into that and
Mhm.
find out and appreciate
Mhm.
and get to know what's different about
Mhm,
the people and your brothers and
mhm.
sisters in your faith communities. And I think we will be all the better for knowing that we have things in common, but loving each other because of our differences.
That's right.
And yeah,
Yeah.
And
I
I
just
think that
appreciate
gives
go ahead.
more glory to God because the same way you are appreciating, you know, nature and the beauty of the world that he creates, you're also appreciating the beauty of the people that he creates.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much. I so appreciate you guys participating in this important discussion. I mean, I don't think I've ever talked to anyone or met anyone in my church community that didn't want our children, all of our children, to see themselves in the image of God. So it's just important to talk about, again, those things that sometimes are barriers that we don't even realize that could keep a child from seeing themselves that way. And we just hope and pray that I'm sure something was said to help our listeners kind of move toward having all children see themselves in that light. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.
Hope that you enjoyed that conversation. It was a real blessing to have Jennifer and Sarah with us. I'm joined here again in the Fam Lab by Rosalind and Tiffany, and we're going to discuss that conversation a little bit further and speak to what resonated with us and what we're hoping that our churches and our families will do in response to some of the great content that was shared in that conversation. But I'll just open it up to Tiffany and Rosalind to share what stood out to you about that conversation. What did you learn?
Tiffany, you want to go first?
Um, the very beginning, one of the things that really caught my attention was when Jennifer was sharing just the facts that children as young as 2 and 3 are picking up on these social cues, these ideas that there's this in group and an out group, and what constitutes somebody being in the in group. What does that look like? But how do people act in that group? And just being aware of that really makes me want to be very intentional from a young age, in a classroom, in a church setting, and at home, and framing it so that children see that we're all in the in group. We're all made in the image of God. And just starting that message to kids very young and very early, instead of holding out thinking, this is a hard conversation. We'll wait till they're more mature. No, they're soaking it in, and they are forming their ideas about who they are and who they are, um, in terms of how they were created and who they were made to be, as preschoolers.
Mhm, mhm. I think that's great. And just to piggyback on that is just to ask the hard questions and be when the kids ask the hard questions to be prepared to talk about the hard questions. And I would say not even to put so much pressure on yourself to know all the answers, but just to engage the questions and to be as truthful as we can and authentic as we can. And I tell you, there's one part for me, and I guess maybe growing up, as a woman of color in religious spaces, when Sarah just talked about how she wasn't sure herself, how she felt about being created in the image of God. And that really struck me because I think, if I'm being honest, I have struggled with those ideas and thoughts and really wondering, do I understand Imago Dei, and do I understand my own creation in His image and how wonderful and unique and valid that is, looking at all the images that I've looked at my entire life, and the kind of the ethnocentric viewpoint that I've kind of learned about God and His creation through. So it's a deep conversation. It's something I think as parents that we should think about ourselves and kind of have an understanding for ourselves. And I think maybe that might make it easier to have these conversations with our kids when we understand our own significance in God's creation.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think as we're, I've got kids in that early age range, and so in thinking about that, I'll admit that, I think what Tiffany said was fair, that sometimes we assume that these are conversations to be had, as kids mature and get older, but, starting uh, young and from a place of our own, spiritual journey is really important. Um, do you think that, there is still an element? I mean, in the conversation, Jennifer and Sarah both talked about, some people find this conversation to be, kind of scary, or, find the idea of, you know, using different resources and different things to be just, a little bit jarring. Like, how do you think we overcome, some of the stigmas around that?
I'm just going to say, after listening to Jennifer and going back and listening again, I thought, wow, I feel like as a person that works with children and children's ministry, I feel like it's a tricky thing. And I have been too calculating, I will say, sometimes at looking at resources and trying to figure out who my audience is and what these resources are. And Jennifer said, uh, when looking at resources, to ask yourself the question, does this recognize the fullness of God's kingdom? And to me, that was a very profound statement. And then I kind of had this epiphany, which I thought, it really doesn't matter how diverse your congregation is, maybe what it looks like. Does this represent the fullness of God's kingdom? When
Mm.
we're looking at what we are sharing and presenting to children, to all of us, it should do that. So that's kind of what I walked away with on that.
Yeah, and going back to what you had said about, having some uh, anxiety or concerns about how you present these conversations that may feel hard, that may feel like you're unprepared to have or to do well. I heard it mentioned in our conversation. I've heard you, Rosalind, say that sometimes it's better to just have the conversation and know that you may not do it perfectly. You may have to ask for forgiveness after the fact. You may learn from your conversation that there are things you can do better, but but putting forth that effort and making it a priority to have those conversations happen is really meaningful, even if you don't do it perfectly. I think the effort and the intention behind it. You mentioned, I believe, that within the church, you've never met somebody who that wasn't their desire. Everybody wants us to have this sense of community and inclusion. I think we all want to acknowledge the value in each other and that we were all made in God's image, and that for that reason alone, we hold value. And so we have this common goal, I think, and we just have this uncertainty about how to get there and what it should look like. And I think when we keep that intention at the forefront, we might make some mistakes along the way, but it's better than just not trying.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So with that, being said, with the goal of, helping all of our kids to recognize that they're made in image of God, and that be foundational to their journey of faith, what are some things that you're hoping that listeners take away from the conversation we just had?
Well, again, I would just reemphasize just what Tiffany said, to not be afraid to have those conversations, to have them often and to have them early, and to seek resources in other people, maybe in your faith communities, seek resources in materials and resources that kind of speak toward this multicultural church that we all strive to be a part of. And as Jennifer pointed out, the resources are getting better, and publishers are putting out resources that are more inclusive and I think more historically accurate from what I can tell. So it does take some effort, but as parents and ministry leaders, I think our the people that we come in contact with, our faith communities, are for sure worth the effort that we put into trying to find things that support our goal in teaching about God's entire creation being unique and especially made by Him.
I also thought what Sarah said was really valuable. She talked about, those little questionnaires she would share with people that, asked about their favorites and what they like to do. And we talked about how there's value in identifying commonalities. There's also value in acknowledging people's differences. But I think for kids especially, they're looking for, those me too's, like, oh, you like this? Me too. And I think when we can help children find connection and build relationships and get to know each other in settings
Mhm.
in church and in our family life, our social gatherings, if we can allow them to make connections and want to build relationships with people who look like them and people who don't look like them and people who share, the
Mhm.
same traditions and people who don't share the same traditions, and allow them to build those
Mhm.
connections, but then also to go beyond that and learn about, how are we all so different? And why is that valuable that we're different? And how did God make us differently? I think that that's something that you can do with kids who are very young and then continue to do as they grow. Hearing, them talk about how meaningful it is for little children to grow up learning these things. I have moments where I think, oh man, like I've missed opportunities as my kids have gotten older. They're still young, but they're well past 2 and 3. And, anyway, I just think that those are things, pointing out commonalities and differences and how throughout all of that, we all are valuable as children of God, is something we can continue to do as our children grow. I don't think you've missed the boat if your children are older. There's still work we can do.
Mhm.
Well, thank you both for sharing. Thank you guys for having this conversation with Jennifer and Sarah. Thank them. We thank them for being with us and giving us so many things to think about. We will include some potential resources that parents can check out in the show notes under the episode. And we'll also have our contact information there if you would like to give us some feedback or some more ideas for how we can all strive to be a multicultural church that truly represents what God has called us to. We would love to hear ideas about that as well. So thank you for joining us this episode. Be looking for more episodes coming very soon. Thanks.